Hello and welcome to Sea Wheels. If you're checking out the channel for the first time, my name's Tim. In a previous video, we talked about air travel in a wheelchair. If you want to check out that video, the link will be in the description below. Today we're going to talk about in more detail air travel with a manual wheelchair. I want to say a big thank you to Tango Medical in Moncton, New Brunswick for providing some of the information we're going to share today. First step, reserving your flight. When traveling with a wheelchair, I highly recommend that you take a look at the airline's disability policies, especially if it's a smaller airline or one that you've not traveled on before. Whether you're new to flying with a chair or a veteran, I highly recommend this. When booking your flight, if you have the option to select seats, even if it's a little bit more money, it can make for an easier transfer if you select an aisle seat that doesn't have a row in front of it. So this could be where business and coach or first and second class change, or at the front of a plane. This will give you more option for your transfer. But do be aware that the armrest on some of these doesn't go up and down, so it could cause a more difficult transfer, so it's good to check with the airline. Next up, I want to talk about the aisle chair. We discussed this a bit in our previous flight video, but if you're new to flying and you've not used one before, I recommend that you contact the airline to get the dimensions of the aisle chair to make sure to accommodate to your needs. Next thing I want to discuss is one of my favorite options, which is the personal care attendant, or PCA. If you're somebody with limited mobility and you need a little bit extra help getting onto the aisle chair and you're more comfortable with a friend or family member than you would be with an airline staff member, you can get a special pass. They'll be able to come through security and help you onto the chair. Now remember, they won't be able to come onto the plane with you, but it does give you a good option to get that little bit of assistance. If you're new to air travel in a wheelchair, you might be worried that they're going to damage or break your wheelchair. Now every airline has a different policy on this, similar to how they handle luggage. If that's something you're concerned about, I recommend that you check out the airline's policy to make sure that you're covered. The next topic is one of my favorite. It's recommended that if you're new to air travel or new to traveling with a disability, to go through a travel agent who either has experience with people with mobility issues or is certified to do so. I'm actually certified to help people with disabilities book their travel to help accommodate to their needs. So if you want to be able to book a vacation or air travel through me, feel free to reach out. My contact information will be in the description and on the bio on the YouTube channel. Next topic is preparing for your trip. If your wheelchair is going to have to be taken apart in any way to be able to get it onto the aircraft, I recommend practicing that if that's something you're not familiar with. That way you can have it done quickly, or to be able to show the airline staff what they need to do so that they can store it for you. The next thing would be to make sure to take the tools that you need to maintenance your chair while you're gone. I can speak from personal experience. Having part of your wheelchair break while you're on vacation can really mess with your vacation, so make sure you pack your tools. I would also check at the airline to make sure you're not breaking any regulations, so that way you know if you can have them in your carry-on versus needing to check them with your bags. And when it comes to wheelchair parts and wheelchair maintenance on your trip or your vacation, I always recommend having solid tires versus air inserts for your main tires. It'll prevent flats while you're on the trip. I honestly don't use air inserts anymore at all on my wheelchair. I go completely with solid. You can run over tack, sharp rock, and not have any issues. I'd also recommend taking a spare set of casters for the front of your chair. I've had at least 2 vacations where I broke the casters in the front of my chair. Absolutely messes your vacation. And when it comes to air travel, like any other piece of luggage that's going to go below the aircraft, you could end up damage on your chair. So it's recommended that you take pictures of your wheelchair from all angles. That way, if something does happen, you have proof of what your chair looked like before it was damaged and after, and that can go back to make sure you know the airline's policy when it comes to damaging chairs. These are rare occurrences, but it's good to have yourself covered. This next thing, I can definitely speak from personal experience. If you're going to go to a destination for a week or so, I would recommend checking out for wheelchair supply companies and medical supply places. That way, if something does happen, you know where to go, so you can get your replacements or your medical supplies. It's also recommended you keep copies of your prescriptions with you. So if you're somebody who self-caths, if you're a Canadian and you're traveling in the US, you will need a prescription for that there. So I recommend keeping all this documentation on you in your carry-on. That way, if there's any issues, you're good to go and it doesn't ruin your vacation. And as mentioned in our previous video, make sure you leave yourself enough time for the flights. If you want more detail on that, check out that video. We just mentioned medical supplies and catheters. If you're going to be on a longer flight or you're new to flying, it can be recommended to use an indwelling catheter. I would always suggest talk to your doctor before doing this to make sure it's something that is healthy for you. And speaking of bathroom, if you're the type of person who has to have a bathroom regimen daily, make sure you go the morning of before the flight. That way you don't run into any troubles on the flight. Promise you that is not a good day. And finally, packing for your trip. If you're somebody who has to take medication daily or has important medication you have to take on your trip, make sure you check local guidelines, especially if you're going from one country to another, as some medications could be prohibited. Just check with the airline as well as customs and you should be good to go. Also check with your doctor if there's any specific ways you're supposed to store your medication. And make sure you keep it in your carry-on, because if your check bag gets lost, you don't want to have important and critical medication taking 3 or 4 days to show up. As well as I'd recommend keeping enough catheters on you if that's something you need for at least 3 to 4 days. And as I mentioned before, you can always find a supply place nearby if you have your prescription that can provide more. As I mentioned earlier, make sure you bring your tools with you that you would need for maintenance in your chair or any spare parts that you may need. And especially remember, if you have an air insert cushion, bring a patch kit and a pump to reinsert it and fix it if you run into any issues. Last thing you want is a flat cushion on your trip. And finally, in preparing your wheelchair, if you took the pictures we talked about earlier, make sure you store those on your phone so you have access to them. And I recommend that you label each part of your chair, especially if parts come off like your tire or your backrest. Put a label on it with your name and your phone number. That way, if one of them goes missing, it can be returned to you, as well as it helps identify that belongs to you. And remember, if you want to be able to travel better, in this case, it's as easy as book through me.